You ever feel like the modern world is just chaotic? Like all the crises, the conflicts, the huge social shifts are completely random and unpredictable? Well, what if I told you there's a simple framework that can bring it all into focus? A kind of mental map that connects our present directly to the very recent past. Let's dive in.
So, here's what we're going to do. First, we'll talk about why the 20th century is so critical for understanding today. Then we'll define a shorter, more intense version of it. We'll break it down into 3 simple acts, look at exactly what we inherited from that time, and finally, give you that new map to make sense of it all.
All right, let's get right to the core problem. A lot of us are living in what you might call a permanent present. You know, it's like trying to figure out the stock market by only looking at this week's news, while totally ignoring huge events like the 2008 crash. We're missing that real connection to the public past that actually built the world we live in right now.
And that feeling of disconnection, that's the real issue. When you can't see the historical wiring behind the walls, today's events just feel random and, honestly, pretty overwhelming. But the truth is, our world was forged in a very specific period of history that's now over. And understanding that period is the key to clarity.
So how do we get a handle on it all?
Well, the first step is to stop thinking about the 20th century as this big 100-year block from 1900 to 2000. We need to focus on a shorter, more intense, and much more coherent period of time.
And here's the crucial idea. It's called the short 20th century. Just think of it as one single, self-contained story that kicks off with World War I and closes with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This isn't just some academic idea. It's a really practical tool for turning the chaos of history into one single understandable narrative. This framework gives us really clear bookends. The era begins in 1914 when the old world was completely shattered, and it ends in 1991 when the whole Cold War system came crashing down. Everything that happens in between those two dates is part of the same single interconnected drama.
Okay, so we've got our timeline locked in. How do we break it down? Forget about complex timelines and confusing charts. We're going to use a really simple and surprisingly memorable analogy.
Yep, a historical sandwich. I know it sounds a little silly, but trust me, it's an incredibly effective way to structure this entire 77-year period. It has 3 very distinct layers, or acts, that fit together perfectly.
So our historical sandwich is made of 3 layers. It starts with the Age of Catastrophe, then it has this brief but brilliant golden age right in the middle, and it all ends with a period called the landslide. Let's take a look at each piece.
The first part, the bottom slice of bread, if you will, was from 1914 through the 1940s, an age of almost unimaginable catastrophe. For over 30 years, the world just stumbled from one disaster straight into another. We're talking 2 world wars, revolutions that totally redrew the map, the Great Depression which brought capitalism to its knees, and the collapse of huge colonial empires.
And then, somehow, out of all that wreckage came the filling of our sandwich, the Golden Age. For about 25 or 30 years, the world saw a period of economic growth and social change so fast and so profound that it was unlike anything in human history. This short window completely reshaped how people lived, worked, and thought all across the globe.
But of course it didn't last. The final act, the top slice of bread, started in the early 1970s. This was the landslide. It was a time when all the certainties of the Golden Age just started to crumble. It was a new era of crisis, of uncertainty, of decay, and it all came to a head with the event that closed out the short 20th century for good, the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So, a historical sandwich. Why should you care? Because the world you're operating in today, your market, the global economy, political alliances, even our social structures, was born directly from how that 3-act drama ended. The end of that era in 1991 didn't just end the Cold War, it's what kicked off the era of hyperglobalization and the digital world that defines our entire modern landscape.
And you can really see the intensity of this era. It was truly a century of extremes. On one hand, you have thinkers like Isaiah Berlin who looked back on it as an unrelenting nightmare, just the most terrible period in history.
And yet, at the very same time, that same period produced the greatest hopes humanity had ever conceived, only to see every single one of them utterly destroyed. It's this violent swing between the extremes, catastrophe and golden age, incredible hope and total despair, that makes this era so powerful and so fundamental to our own. Look, the key takeaway here is that this model gives you a real strategic edge. When you understand the short 20th century, suddenly you see the origins of our globalized economy, and you see its vulnerabilities. You get the historical fault lines that are running right underneath today's geopolitical conflicts. And most importantly, you finally escape that permanent present and start seeing the hidden logic of the world you have to navigate every single day.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground pretty quickly, so let's just do a quick recap to lock in this new mental map.
Here's what you really need to remember. First, from now on, think of 1914 to 1991 as one single story. Second, that story has three parts: catastrophe, a golden age, and then a landslide. And third, using this simple historical sandwich model is a genuinely powerful tool for connecting the dots between that chaotic past and our complex present.
And all of that leaves us with a final, pretty fascinating question. That entire historical era, the Age of Extremes, is over. It ended more than 30 years ago. So the question we all have to ask ourselves now is, what age are we living in today?
Understanding the past gives us the clarity we need to act in the present. So, if you want to take action, move forward, and find more clients, you can book a free call with CT Marketing using the link below.